Alright guys, welcome to another video of our React tutorial series. In our last video we talked about the use effect hook, and in this video we're going to talk about the use context hook. Let me draw our mind back to when we talked about the props in React.js. We remembered how it was a little bit difficult to pass in data from one page to another, from one component to another. Now I want us to just imagine we have 5 different layers of components, and we want to pass data through this layer to get to the last component that really needs this data. What do? We go ahead to pass data from one prop to another prop to another prop, even when those props do not need those data that we're passing to it. So that is the problem we are having in React, and we're going to solve this problem using the use context hook. So here I say the React context hook allows components to access shared data without needing to pass props manually, right? Just like I explained, it provides a simple way to avoid prop drilling and keep your code clean, right? We're going to explain what prop drilling means as we proceed, right? It is exactly what I explained. Passing props from different layers of components, even when those components don't need them. If I have 10 layers of components, you're going to pass props through those 10 layers before you can get to the actual prop that needs this data. So that is what use context is coming to solve for us. So here I just provided what our code would look like without a use context hook. Here we have a main component, which is the app component. Here we have a state with the name John Doe. Of course, we have the current component. We're going to pass a prop to the current component. From the current parent component, we have a child component. We're going to pass the prop to the child component. From the child component, we have another child component where we have access to the. So it becomes a problem when you talk about maintenance, you talk about reusability and making our codes cleaner, right? That is why we want to look at how we can create a central data that can be shared throughout the components without having to pass the data from the components to the components as props. Now have a central data that all the components will have access to and make good use of it. Funny enough, or the most interesting part is that this data can also be changed from these different components. And here I said these are the few problems you're going to encounter with props drilling. And I said it is hard to manage in large applications. You're building a very large e-commerce, a social media website, a fintech applications. Prop drilling becomes a problem. It is unnecessary props passed through components, right? Even the components that do not need those data, passing through it because you want it to pass through to the actual component that needs it, right? And I said it is hard to refactor later. When you start writing all of these and you want to come back later to refactor your code, it becomes a problem. So this is basically what we're going to achieve. We have page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4 all sharing data from the context. So we don't need to pass props from page 1 to page 2 to page 3 before the data can go across our components or across our pages. We have our pages and we have a central context that will manage our data. So let's head over to our code editor to demonstrate how the use context hook works and how we can use it to build a central data center for our pages and components to share from. Alright guys, here in our code editor, we're going to demonstrate how the use context hook works and how to use it to build a central data center where all our components, our pages can share data from. So here we're going to create a context using the react.createContext hook. We're going to provide values using of course, the context provider, and we're going to see how to consume these values and, if possible, update these values from different components and different pages. So the first thing we're going to do is going to go over to our state folder and create a file called context.jsx. So in our context.jsx, I'm going to import React. I'm also going to import create context, and I'm also going to import use state, all from React. Right? If I do this, the next thing we're going to do is to create a context. So let me write a comment, create a context. How do we create context? We create context by initializing the create context hook, right? See export const user context. So we're creating the user context, which is just a calling to initializing the create context hook, right? We imported the create context already, right? So the next thing we're going to do is to create a provider component. How do we do that? We say const user provider. The user provider is going to have children props, right? And the user provider is just going to return the children. So one thing is very important to note here. In the user provider, we're going to create a state, right? We're going to create a state that will handle the user data. We're going to say const state. Of course, we're going to call it user and set user, which is going to be equal to use state. The default value is going to be a default value of the user with a name property Paul and a message property called please subscribe. So after this, right, then we can now return our children in JSX. So how do we return that? We do that by returning the user context we created already, right? And that is it. Remember, we created this user context here. So we're having the provider component, the provider property, and this is very important. It has a value property. This value property will make the values we want to share available to every component that will connect to this. So right, if we do this, the next thing we're going to do is to export our user provider, by default. So we're going to say export default user provider. That is it for this page, right? We've been able to create a store and provide both the user and the set user value to the store, to every component that connects to this store, right? So the next thing to do is to wrap this store around our app.jsx, right? How do we do that? We're going to import our user provider in our app.jsx. So I'm going to say import user provider from our state. We're importing it in our app.jsx, right? After doing that, the next thing we're going to do is to wrap our component with the user provider. So this is going to be This is going to be user provider, and we're going to have user provider. So the user provider is going to have all the children. It's going to have all the children wrapped around it, right? Remember, we imported the user provider from our state. So what is the first chart that we want to render? So let's move over to our profile card. If you've been following this tutorial, you should have a profile card. Inside our profile card, we're going to render our profile card to this. So we're going to do this. Of course, that will help us to import profile card to our page, right? That is it for the app.jsx. So we'll move over to the profile card page. In the profile card page, what are we supposed to do here? We're supposed to import the user context, which we're going to create a context and provide all the data that is available in that context to the user, right? First of all, we're going to import the user context. Remember, we're importing the user context using the name import method because we did not export the user component, the user context, as a default component, or using the default export. That is why we're able to import it using the name export. So the next thing to do is to create a hook, create a use context hook. Remember, the use context, the React hooks are supposed to appear inside the main component. In this case, the main component here is the profile component, and that means we're going to say const user should be equal to use context. And what is the context we are using? It is the context we already created, which is the user context, right? So I'm correcting this. This is supposed to be user context, right? So we're going to import user context. We're going to import user context from our state, right? So this is not the only data available from this user context. If you check here, we also have the set user, and we're also going to make that available to this. If I save this, go back to our application, nothing happens, but let's be sure we're on the safe side by checking our developer tool. Inside our developer tool, we're on clear ground. So let's proceed. And let's make sure we're also doing the right thing. Let me just try to log out the user to make sure everything is connected. If I log out this user, go back to my developer tool, to my console, we now have access to this user object with the message property and the name properties. That means we succeeded in sharing data between the context and the profile card, right, without passing it as props. So let's just see how we can create this by creating this, say, user.name, and I'm going to duplicate this and change this to an italic tag and say user.message. Let's add some styling to our div. Let's change the background color to light blue. So you have this. That means we can now have access to this data. But remember, in our use context, in our context.jsx, we said we can change the value of this state from anywhere. That was why we provided it as the value in our user context provider. So how do we do that? We already have the value here. So we're going to create a button, add an event listener to the button, and add event handler that will help us to update the user. If you did not get what event handler does, or if you're confused on what we're going to do next, go back to our video where we talked about event handling and in React.js, and after watching that, you can come back to continue this video. So first, I'm going to create a button. First, let me break this line and just paste that multiple times, and I'm going to create a button. Inside this button, I'm going to say change user data. If I save this, you're going to see a button, right? That just did that SS. So we have this button. If I click on this button, it's supposed to change this user. So let's create an event handler. Let's create an event handler. I'm going to say function user handler. This user handler is just going to set the user to a new object, and I'm going to change the name to gold, and I'm going to say please subscribe to my channel if you have not. If you have not, if I save this, and the last thing I'm going to do is to create the onClick event and passing the event handler to handle it, right? Passing the event handler to handle it. So therefore, let's just make sure we're on clear standing. Let's inspect our developer tool, check our console, so we're good. So the next thing we're going to do, I'm going to reload this page and click on this button. If I click on this button, you see we now have gold as a new name, and I'm saying please subscribe to my channel if you have not. So that is it, guys. That is how to use the use context hook to create a central data that can be shared between components, between pages, and can also be updated from pages and from components. If you found this video helpful, guys, please don't forget to comment, share, and like. See you guys in the next video. Bye.